Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast is number 1416. The topic is nutrition and the title is, Where Should I Set My Macro Targets in My App? So, had a client ask me this question, and this comes up, relatively often, maybe more often than what you might think, because it came up more often than what I thought. But client basically wanted to know, in my programming with my clients, we don't have specific targets. We have ranges. So, for example, the calories might be eat between 22 to 2,400 calories. Protein might be, get between 160 to 180 grams of protein. So there's ranges. Now, why do we use ranges? It's because it's more realistic. So if I tell you to eat 2,200 calories every day, it's unlikely you're going to literally eat 2,200 calories every single day. No matter how hard you try, you might be at 2,201 or 2,198. You're going to be very close. No matter how hard you try, you're just not going to hit literally to the calorie value every single day. And same thing with protein as well. So we want a realistic goal. I don't want you to feel like a failure because you were 5 calories over, whenever 5 calories makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. 0. So why we have ranges is it's a realistic goal. You can actually achieve consistency within a range. And then it understands, I want to promote my clients to understand the impact of variance on our results. So for example, if they are 5 calories over, that has absolutely no negative impact on our results. Even if they're like 50 calories over, doesn't really make much of a difference. So I want them to know what is significant versus what is not. So by having ranges, it allows it to be more consistent and feel like it's success, and allows them to understand that successful nutrition is consistency over time, and we don't want too much variance from day to day, but a small amount of variance really doesn't matter. If a person's 43 calories under or 43 calories over, 0 impact, none. So I don't have a specific way I start every single client with in regards to like the size of the ranges that we use, because everybody's coming into working with me with different backgrounds. Some people are brand new to tracking food, some people are advanced athletes, so it's huge variance. So I have one person, they have a 900 calorie window because that's how chaotic their food was. It was so sporadic from day to day that being within a 900 calorie window would be more consistent. I have other clients, they have a 100 calorie window because they have really high freaking goals and they want to achieve awesome things, so the variance has to be smaller. For protein, some people have a 40 gram window, between 160 to 200 grams of protein, for example. Some people might have a 20 gram window. So it really kind of depends on kind of like where your current habits are and what would allow you to have more consistency than that. So one client example is their average caloric intake was 2,874, but they were one day 609 calories over that, and one day 764 calories below that. So they had an average, but they were plus 21% and minus 26%. So they had a huge range. Their protein was even a bigger range. So the average was 181 grams, but they had one day they were over by 86 grams, another day they were under by 78 grams. So the variance was plus 47%, minus 43%. So that means that it was pretty wild numbers. So what I wrote to them was, all of these numbers show us that our current targets aren't an issue. So this person was wondering if their current numbers were too high, and that's why it was causing them, their current targets, like their intended numbers, were too high, and if that was causing them not to lose body fat. And what I wanted to essentially reply back to them is the targets aren't a problem because we're not actually meeting the targets. So if we wrote down what their target was, like what it ended up being, was they had a 2,874 calorie average, but a range from 2,100 all the way up to 3,500. That's huge. That's a 1400 calorie range. Protein, they did 181 average, but a range from 103 to 267. That's huge. It's 164 grams of protein difference, between days. So we have to bring those targets that is what their habits were, and they weren't the targets that we were aiming for. So adjusting the targets we were aiming for wasn't going to make any difference because we weren't even hitting those targets. So if I'm shooting at clay pigeons and then you tell me I'm going to change the chart over here, like this bullet target, I'm going to change it from a circular target. I want to put maybe a star pattern. And I'm like, that's fine. I'm shooting clay pigeons. Why would I care what that paper is, right? So no clue why that's an analogy in my head. But the idea is us changing the targets wouldn't have mattered because that wasn't where this person was shooting. So what I wanted to do was to explain to them that, and I explained this in more depth in podcast 1408. So just like 8 podcasts ago, it was a nutrition podcast titled The Effects of Effort Without Accuracy. And we talked about this person's actual kind of example. So what we ended up doing was we narrowed their current habits to a plus or minus 15% variance. So they were doing a plus or minus 20+% variance in calories and a 40+% variance in protein. So I was like, let's just get you down to a 15% variance. What that meant was their calories should be between 2,400 to 3,300. And that would be an improvement. Protein should be between 150 to 200. And that would be an improvement. So where you set your range kind of depends on what you're doing coming into the time of trying to set a range. Now, the question becomes, if we're going to use ranges, but if we're using tracking apps that only allow specific number targets, which is absolute trash. I don't know why tracking apps do this. It's stupid and frustrating. Should just make my own app. But if your app only allows specific number targets, like you have to pick, say, 2,400 calories, you can't say good for me is between 22 to 2,400. You have to pick a number. Well, do you pick 2,200? Do you pick 2,400? Do you pick 23 in the middle? What do you do? So if we're looking at where do we set our macro targets in our apps, the options are kind of like the bottom of the range, the middle of the range, or the top of the range. And this would be true of protein as well. But the simple answer is I would set it at the bottom of the range if you tend to undereat. So if you tend to fall short of your macros. So let's say your goal is 2,200 to 2,400 and you very rarely make 2,200. Some days you make it, but some days you don't. Then I would set your target at the bottom of the range. So that way you at least hit the minimum. So if you struggle to hit the minimum, you should set your target at the minimum. And then inversely, that's true, is if you tend to overeat, set your target at the top of your range. So you're like, okay, I could be within 200 calories of this target, and I'll still be within my range. But if I go over it, boom, I'm in trouble. That means I overate. So if I tend to overeat, I want to protect against overeating. If I tend to undereat, I want to protect against undereating, right? Now, what about the middle of the range? I don't typically recommend that for clients because most people tend to have a problem of undereating or overeating. But I can understand why clients do this because they're like, okay, I'm going to set at the middle range. If I'm plus or minus 100 calories, I'm good to go. Perfect. So if you don't have a trend of undereating or a trend of overeating, then setting it in the middle is a good idea. And then just understand, okay, if I'm plus or minus whatever my appropriate range is, let's say your calories are, say, 1,700 to 2,100. Well, that's a 400 calorie window, so you set it in the middle and you say, well, as long as I'm plus or minus 200 each direction, I'm good to go. So that is kind of the quick and easy answer, is if I tend to undereat, I want to protect against undereating. So I set it at the bottom of the range. If I tend to overeat, I want to protect against overeating, so I set it at the top of the range. If I don't really have like an overwhelming habit, I kind of, some days I hit it and some days I don't. Some days I'm over, some days I'm under. Some days I feel like a nut and sometimes I don't. So almond joy, whatever those commercials are. But set it in the middle range then. And then know, okay, if I'm plus or minus whatever my window is, then I know I'm okay. So no matter where you set it, though, we also need to track that you achieve it. And this is what I mentioned in the podcast 1408, which was a nutrition podcast titled The Effects of Effort Without Accuracy, is no matter where you set your targets, you have to track that you actually got them. we need a big picture perspective rather than just a day-to-day perspective, because we often forget day-to-day. I tend to focus on today, forgetting what happened yesterday, and sure as hell forgot what happened 3 days ago, So it helps to have a big picture as you also focus on the small picture. So results are created by meal, but they're seen week by week. So you have to be able to see both. You have to be able to see what you do meal by meal, day by day, but then also see the trend of weeks after weeks after weeks. So you might have these targets, but how often are you actually hitting them? Aiming for a target doesn't mean you're successful. Achieving the target means you're successful. Often when I talk to people, they feel that if they're under the pressure of the diet, they're doing the diet. No, you have to actually do the diet to do the diet. So, they'll be like, well, I'm following the plan. No, you're attempting the plan. You're not actually following it. So you'll talk to them and they're like, well, I've been following the plan. And I'm like, well, if you look at the last 14 days, you only got 5 out of 14 days correct. So you're not really following the plan. You're aware of the plan and you're aiming for the plan, but you're not technically following the plan. So we all have to kind of be careful of our own self-deceptions, myself included. I do this too, so I got to be on guard myself. Is we tend to praise ourselves for efforts rather than accuracy. And that's a big thing in life. Big thing. So no matter where you set your targets, make sure you track that you're actually accurate with them as well. Okay? Now, before I leave, I want to kind of rattle off some good podcasts that I think can help towards tracking your nutrients. We have podcast 1303, so 1303. It's a Q&A podcast titled What to Do When Tracking Calories Isn't Working. So if you've been tracking your calories but you're not seeing the results you want, podcast 1303 would be a good one to check out. If you have trouble finding old podcasts, Google search Brutal Iron Gym Podbean. You'll see there's a homepage on Podbean website for the podcast. On the right side of the page, in the middle of the page, there's a search function. You can just type in the number, you can type in a word from the title or the title itself, and it'll show up. Okay. We also have podcast 1143. So 1143, nutrition podcast titled How to Track Foods When You Can't Measure Them. That's very helpful. We also have podcast 1094. It's a nutrition podcast titled Daily Tracking Options to Improve Consistency. So if you want to know when should you enter your data, the podcast 1094 would be very helpful. Okay. Now, last one, because there's like 40 of them. So the last one I'll give you is podcast 658. It's a nutrition podcast titled Diet Tracking, Getting the Most from the Least. So that way you know what's the least amount of things you have to track to get all the progress you want. Okay? Pretty awesome. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this gave you some ideas, gave you some food for thought, and now you have an idea of where to set your macros, and hopefully it helps you improve consistency. If you have any questions or if you ever need anything, I'm only an email away. Our email is brutaliron@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Please consider sharing the podcast. If the podcast has been helpful in your life, please consider sharing it. Sharing it on social media reaches the most amount of people. You can share it in a conversation. The idea of sharing it is that the information of the podcast gets into more people's lives and can help them just kind of do better in their life. And that's kind of my main goal of the podcast, is just to help people live healthier and happier lives. Well, okay. And then also, you can consider donating to the podcast. The podcast is well over $1,000 a year for hosting costs. I give an hour to it every day. I'd love to keep it for free. So thank you to those who do already donate. We have some people sign up for monthly donations. Some people have given some one-time donations, which is really appreciated. Just appreciate helping to cover the cost of it. So that way it makes a little more business sense. But if you do want to donate to the podcast, you can do so at our website at www.brutalirongym.com. We have options for a one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation. Also, if you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything you want to know, let us know at our email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.